Hello, it's Veronica, the heart dietitian. Today we're talking all about foods to avoid if you have high blood pressure. And I think this is really important because a lot of individuals who I speak with on a daily basis who are trying to manage their blood pressure, they are aware that the nutrient sodium increases their blood pressure, and they are aware that they need to restrict the nutrient sodium. And where is sodium found? It's found in salt. So what do they restrict? They restrict the salt shaker. But I'm here to tell you that that isn't the food that I want you to avoid or eat less often. Okay, let me tell you why. So in North America, we are eating too much sodium. And so it is widely known. They've done a great campaign at making us understand that we're eating too much sodium and understand that sodium comes from salt. However, the thing that a lot of people don't know is that when we look at sodium intake in North Americans, the majority of the sodium intake is coming from processed foods and restaurant meals. It's not coming from the salt shaker. About 5 to 15% of our intake is coming from the salt shaker. About 70% of our intake of sodium is coming from processed and restaurant meals. So, really, what are the foods we need to restrict or avoid? It's the processed foods or restaurant meals. So before I get into the exact foods, I wanted to talk a little bit about sodium and what it does to our body. So when we eat too much sodium, our body wants to get rid of it. Our body likes to have the amount of sodium in a specific range. So if it's too much sodium, if it's out of that range and it's too high, then our body wants to get rid of the sodium so that it stays within that balance. And if it's too low, then our body holds on to the sodium, so it keeps it within that balance. So what happens is when we have too much sodium, our body wants to get rid of it. So how do we get rid of sodium? Well, we can excrete it through our urine. Now, how should we urinate? Well, we need to consume fluids in order to do that. So if you've ever had an extremely salty meal, you may have noticed that you are very thirsty. And that's your body's way of asking for more fluids so that it can flush out this extra sodium. Pretty neat, eh? I love our body. However, once it's doing that, we're drinking more fluids. We have more fluids in our body, and we have more fluid in our blood, going through our blood. And so we have more fluid that's pushing on the artery walls, and that's making our blood pressure go up. So more pressure because more fluid so that we can drink more and then eventually excrete more sodium. So that's how it works in our body. Now, when we have too high of blood pressure for a really long time, it can cause a lot of damage, and that's what we're trying to avoid. So, yes, we want to restrict the sodium so that our body doesn't have to, put so much stress on our artery walls to try to dilute that extra sodium with more fluid. So that's one way of managing blood pressure. And then the other way is through something called the DASH diet. So DASH is an acronym, stands for Dietary Approaches to Stop Hypertension. It's an excellent diet that's shown to reduce blood pressure as quickly as medication and as effectively, even more effectively, in some of the research trials, which is extremely impressive through food. And not only does the DASH diet restrict sodium, but it also makes sure that you're having enough nutrients through other foods. So nutrients like potassium, magnesium, calcium, and that's through a lot of plant foods, as well as it's a very low sugar, lower fat diet. So we're not here to talk about what to add. We want to talk about what foods to avoid. So remember, to make a really big impact on reducing our sodium, we want to focus on restaurant meals as well as processed foods. So let's think about processed foods. What are processed foods? One of the biggest processed foods in North Americans' diets is bread. So I often put a picture on, if I'm doing a slideshow or a PowerPoint, I guess, to an audience, I often put a picture of typical breakfast. So you have bacon and eggs and bread as like a typical breakfast you get at a restaurant. And I ask individuals, where is the sodium coming from? And often people are saying, oh, I know, Veronica, it's the bacon. But it's not necessarily the case. The bread can actually contribute, one slice could have like 200 to 400 milligrams of sodium. You have two slices at 400 milligrams, that's 800 milligrams. That's like half of your daily intake in just the bread alone. So it's really important to check your bread and look for bread that is lower in sodium. So you could do that in two ways. You want to look at the nutrition facts panel, look at the sodium amount, try to find a sodium with a percent daily value of about 5% or less. And then you can also check the ingredient list to see if they have added salt there. So a lot of the time they're adding salt. Yes, I guess we need a little bit of salt to make bread, but often we don't need as much salt as people or manufacturers are putting in our bread. Usually it's to keep it on the shelf longer, but also because it tastes good. And a lot of people have a high sodium tolerance because we are consuming a lot of sodium. Number two food to eat less often is pizza. And pizza is high in sodium because it has a lot of high salt toppings. So things like processed meats, olives, cheese, even the pizza sauce itself can be high in salt. So watching all of those toppings can be a way to lower your sodium. So maybe choosing a lower sodium sauce, making your own sauce at home, adding some fresh veggies if you can, maybe lower sodium cheese as well, and making your dough if you can. There's a fantastic dough recipe. I'll link it down below. It's really quick and easy to make and very low in sodium. So I'm not saying you can never have pizza, but you just need to be careful that pizza could be one of those foods that is contributing a lot of sodium into your diet. Third, we have deli meats. So deli meats are just high in salt because that's how they preserve them. And they're also rich in nitrates. So deli meats in general, for general health concerns, is something that we do try to reduce generally because it is also been linked to colon cancer. So trying to eat less deli meat would be good for everyone, not just individuals who are trying to reduce their blood pressure or manage their heart health in any way. And that's not saying that you can never have sandwiches because there's a lot of sandwich fillings other than deli meat that you could use instead. So things like homemade hummus would be a great alternative. Even tuna salad, egg salad sandwiches are great. You could make a peanut butter and banana sandwich would be a great alternative. And I made a video that I'll link below about some deli meat alternative sandwiches to try. And they're really quick, easy recipes that taste great. Next food is canned soups. So canned soups are extremely high in sodium. There are a few that are lower in sodium, so you can check the nutrition facts panel to make sure that you're choosing a lower sodium option. But the best way to have a soup that's low in sodium is make it yourself. This way you can control the ingredients. You can use a low sodium broth, and maybe if you're using beans and legumes, you use low sodium beans and legumes, add a bunch of veggies, and it's a really great recipe that can lower your blood pressure. So trying to reduce your canned soup alternatives is a great way to do that. A lot of grocery stores also carry soups that are in the refrigerator section. So perhaps in like the produce area of your grocery store, if they're being preserved by temperature instead of the salt. So I find that often those soups that are in that part of the grocery store are often lower in sodium. So I check those out as well. So interestingly, Campbell's Soup had reduced their sodium intake a while back. So they knew sodium was bad and soups, contribute a lot to the sodium. So they went ahead and they said, okay, let's do this. Let's reduce the sodium of these soups. And guess what happened? Nobody bought them. So, a lot of the time, it's our taste buds, it's what we're used to. And a way to really flavor food without salt is through herbs and spices. And a lot of the time, that's more expensive for companies to use. So, they use salt as a replacement. Some other foods that are high in salt are things like pickles or olives, anything in a brine. Kimchi is also high in salt. So those are things that you don't want to overdo. You can have in moderation. So it's just important to know that they're high salt and use them sparingly if it's something that you do enjoy. I also spoke about canned tomato products are often really high in sodium too. And that's because tomatoes are often really acidic. So they add a lot of sugar in to reduce the acidity of kind of cheaper tomatoes. And then they have to kind of balance it out with the added salt. So looking for canned tomato options that have low sodium or no salt added nutrition claim across the top of the or the front of package would be a good way to have a low sodium canned tomato product. Another food that I spoke about already is cheese. Cheese is often very high in salt. Again, not saying that you can't have it, but you do want to have it in moderation. Condiments like pestos, even ketchup, mustard, a lot of things that are in a bottle, sauces, salad dressings, those are all really high in salt too. So check those labels. They add salt because it makes it taste good and it's inexpensive to do. Those are a lot of the foods that I recommend just being aware of and trying to eat in moderation. Other processed foods would be like snacky foods like chips, pretzels, even salted nuts. All of those foods also contribute to our sodium intake. And then the last food I wanted to mention was alcohol. So, alcohol does increase our blood pressure. And it is something, again, we want to kind of like deli meats that we don't want to overconsume because it does have other health consequences like causing cancer, contributing to our cancer risk. So, managing your alcohol intake can really help to manage your blood pressure as well. So, I hope that gives you some areas to look at what you're eating. Are you eating any of those foods? Can you reduce some of those foods? And then also think about foods that you can add because remember that DASH diet that I talked about, the one that can lower your blood pressure through food, isn't just about restricting sodium, but it's also about including foods, including plant foods, foods that are rich in potassium, magnesium, and calcium, fibers. Really, really important to help with the management of blood pressure. So think about the foods that you can restrict, perhaps eat out less often, and then also think about those foods that you can eat more often that are those DASH diet rich foods. So if you made it to the end of this video, make sure you hit subscribe because I come out with new content every week all about how to eat for a better heart. See you next week.